Space, a concept which we may not fully understand as of now, but is still something incredibly powerful and incredibly fundamental for the universe. So, when characters in fiction can manipulate said concept, especially to higher degrees than what we can normally comprehend, it makes them incredibly interesting, but also incredibly dangerous. So let me introduce SpaceGodzilla, Godzilla's clone created from his DNA being shot into white holes, and Palkia, created by Arceus and is the master of space in the Pokemon universe. Today we'll be putting these two masters of space head to head in today's battle, joined by a special guest who I've collabed with previously, Umbria. I've collabed with him on his channel on his Sonic vs. Godzilla video, and it was quite the pleasure collabing on that. So I would love to introduce him as he explains Palkia's scaling right now.
Hello everyone, I am very happy to be here, and a huge thank you to Viper for having me on his channel. He recently assisted me in the creation of one of my own videos, so I am more than happy to appear on his channel next and return the favor. For Palkia's scaling, I will not be including any HM moves. I'm going to stick to what any moves it can learn naturally, as well as any other abilities that we've seen it use in any other game, anime, or manga material. That being said, we're also not using a specific version of Palkia, say the anime for example. We're going to be pulling from every bit of Pokemon media that we can in order to properly gauge Palkia's power. Now, this might sound unusual, however, given the context of how the Pokemon cosmology works, with the games and the anime being confirmed to just be alternate timelines, and the overall lore and mythology that legendary Pokemon have, I think it's fair to pull from other timelines canonically, so to speak, in order to properly gauge Palkia's power. Now, let's jump right into it. Palkia is part of the Creation Trio, one of 3 Pokemon created by Arceus, or Arceus, who is the creator of the entire Pokemon cosmology. Palkia specifically is responsible for controlling and maintaining spatial dimensions, being the physical embodiment of space. This all sounds well and good, but just how powerful is Palkia? Well, in its debut game, a man named Cyrus had intended on capturing Palkia and using its power to create an entirely new universe, which very nearly came to fruition, nearly resetting all of reality. We even see this portal to this universe beginning to form. So, at the very least, Palkia would find itself in the universal ranges of power. This sort of power isn't inconsistent at all for Palkia, given that whenever Palkia and Dialga get into a tussle, their fights have a tendency to, well, potentially break reality and destroy entire universes as a side effect. We see this happening in the Pokemon manga. However, given context for how the Pokemon universes work, this would actually find itself into the Universal Plus ranges. As confirmed in an interview with Masuda, he confirms that Pokemon universes are in fact infinite in size. So Palkia here can not only rewrite infinite-sized universes, but also create them too. Now, for those who don't know, the Pokemon cosmology is comprised of an infinite number of universes. Every single game cartridge that you buy, or any saved game that you have of Pokemon ever, is all canonically a Pokemon universe. We see this stated in-game and also in the anime as well. That being said, Palkia is maintaining all of these spaces, binding the spatial dimensions together, as well as keeping them apart. That being said, and given that Pokemon universes are in fact infinite in size, this would put Palkia in the Multiversal Plus ranges of power. Now, this actually is quite consistent. We've seen in both the Pokemon manga and the anime that whenever Palkia and Dialga fight, they threaten the space-time continuum, opening portals to other dimensions, as well as affecting them, and even causing time to reverse, all just as a side effect of them fighting with one another. And in the manga, they straight up start causing reality to cease to exist. Now, for the higher ends for Palkia, they're both stated and shown to reside in their own dimensions, and in order to properly communicate with them, you need to transcend the boundaries of time and space, as seen in the Arceus, Arceus, and the Jewel of Life movie. With this in mind, and given just the nature of what Palkia is supposed to be, being the maintainer of spatial dimensions, would more than likely find itself in the 5th dimensional or low complex multiversal ranges of power. This is also supported with a model that we see, referred to in Pokemon as the time-space axis, where we see a model of their home dimensions above the normal Pokemon universe at the very bottom. So while not explicitly stated to be higher dimensional, it's pretty much implied, given the statements and also the model itself, that Palkia and the trio in general exists in a higher dimensional plane, meaning that they are fifth-dimensional beings who can fight other fifth-dimensional beings, such as the physical avatar of Arceus, who at the very least is also stated to exist beyond the confines of time and space, as we see in Pokemon Legends Arceus at the beginning of the game, and even the time-space axis device. Now let's talk about speed. Palkia, at the very least, would more than likely be in the infinite to immeasurable speed tiering. Given it maintains the Pokemon universe, which is infinite in size, it would also at least compare to, if not upscale from other Pokemon like Necrozma. Necrozma being a Pokemon that is capable of illuminating all of Ultra Space, which contains a countless number of Ultra Wormholes, and also is more than likely infinite in size, given what we discussed earlier. Now let's quickly dive into Palkia's moves, abilities, and hacks. There's a lot of moves which I'm sure Viper can put on screen, but I'll go over some of the main ones. You've got moves like Spatial Rend, where the user tears the target along with the space around it. You have Dragon Breath, which can temporarily paralyze opponents. You have moves like Ancient Power, which can potentially raise Palkia's own power and speed. It can passively heal itself with moves like Aqua Ring, can shoot aura power deep from within its body with Aura Sphere, an attack that never misses. And for a certain amount of time, it can even block its opponents from being healed, whether it's using other moves or any items or abilities, via the move Heal Block. Palkia is immortal in the physical embodiment of the concept of space. It can travel to different dimensions, create portals, can amplify its stats via certain moves. It can warp reality and straight up erase things from existence, as mentioned earlier. Resurrection. It resurrected Darkrai in the manga. And arguably conceptual manipulation, given that Cyrus desired Palkia to create a world without spirit, emotion, or will, which was what Palkia was doing. And we know in Pokemon lore that emotion, spirit, and will are concepts embodied by 3 Pokemon: Azelf, Uxie, and Mesprit. These 3 Pokemon's power made the red chain that also temporarily contained Palkia, and Dialga, depending on the game. Now let's recap. Palkia would at the very least be Universal Plus to Multiversal Plus, all the way up to being a 5th-dimensional being for its attack potency, or Low Complex Multiversal, and for its speed, it would find itself to be in the infinite to immeasurable speeds. Alrighty, I believe that just about does it for Palkia's scaling. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of the video. Peace.
Thank you, Umbria, for explaining all of Palkia's scaling. With that out of the way, and with us understanding where he would scale, let's go right into SpaceGodzilla's scaling. SpaceGodzilla is a character whose power he uses and comes from is something called supergravity. Supergravity being a higher dimensional form of gravity, which is backed up by the fact that only higher dimensional beings flat out in the Godzilla interconnected cosmology have been shown to use supergravity, and it's only been referenced then. While this would normally simply be only 4th dimensional, something we know is that since the Showa cosmology connects to the Heisei one via numerous statements and such things connecting of such, this would be higher dimensional than the cosmology that not only is infinite in size verbatim, but has several 4th dimensional spaces outright off of the Zone Fighter, which is connected with the Showa era. Meaning it's a infinitely 4D structure, and since SpaceGodzilla has higher dimensional gravity than this, and his attacks are higher dimensional regardless and using this higher dimensional gravity, this would result in SpaceGodzilla being 5th dimensional or low complex multiversal. And due to the fact that SpaceGodzilla has infinite of this power, this would make SpaceGodzilla a infinitely 5th dimensional being, which this line of scaling is consistent considering he fights 94 Heisei, who is superior consistently to Orochi foes who have statements of such as transcending dimensions, creating the cosmology, and so on. Which, if you want to if you want to argue things such as SpaceGodzilla transcending physics, it's possible he's 6th dimensional. So this higher dimensional scaling for SpaceGodzilla is nowhere in the slightest inconsistent due to just the pure consistency off of this, not only off of himself and his own feats, but the upscaling he would get from beating heisei Godzilla at the start of the film. While obviously he loses at the end of the film, this is because of a growth factor, which we will get into a little bit later. And obviously with this tier of speed, since he transcends time and space and is not bound by it, he would be breaking the speed equation, landing him in those immeasurable tiers of speed. For hacks, SpaceGodzilla is a hacks monster and has them in spade. He can obviously manipulate gravity to an insane degree, especially with his super gravity. He can absorb energy, even infinite amounts of it, and the energy of his opponents as well, using them to try and use their own energy and power to beat them, or shields to reflect his opponent's attacks as well. However, his best hacks would come from the fact that he's made of Godzilla cells. He would get their properties to a degree. Since obviously he lost to Heisei at the end of the film, he wouldn't get anything of that version of Heisei Godzilla and anything in the 95 film of Godzilla vs. Destroyer. However, he should upscale off of any of the hacks or showings that the cells and adaptation, etc., has performed in the previous films, such as the immortality, allowing him to always come back from a cell, his insane regeneration, or the fact his cells reactively evolve and grow, even allowing Godzilla to take his own attacks reflected back at him 10,000 times over without much damage and no physical scar or anything, and simply just overcoming the opponent regardless. This would apply to SpaceGodzilla as well, due to him obviously being made of Godzilla cells. So this isn't inconsistent, obviously. He can also resist the effects of black and white holes, which do things like gravity manipulation, so it's not like this is inconsistent. SpaceGodzilla should also upscale off of Heisei Cell's ability to come back from being erased from existence and not only having his own conceptual statements, but destroying other arguable conceptual and purely energy-based beings. So, in the end, who wins? Well, wealth should be infinitely into 5th dimensional. SpaceGodzilla does have the better arguments for higher into the 6th dimensional or into 6th dimensional tiers of power, or maybe even higher into 5th dimensional than Palkia. But assuming we just say they're both 5th or infinitely 5th dimensional, a big factor in this fight is the growth factor SpaceGodzilla has via the cells of Godzilla. Well, once again, obviously not as good as Godzilla's own in later on films, it's still good enough to where he can overcome things that are hundreds to tens of thousands of times stronger than itself, and adapt to it, among many other things such as immortality, regeneration, having its own attacks reflected back at it, so on. It just means he's very adaptable and would constantly be growing throughout the fight. So even if Palkia was hundreds of times stronger than SpaceGodzilla, this wouldn't even matter. SpaceGodzilla, while does have more survivability and immortality, Palkia has several moves that could actually negate this. So while it may not negate the evolution and reactive adaptation itself, it would negate the regeneration and immortality SpaceGodzilla has, which would leave him a lot more vulnerable. While Palkia does have more mastery over the concept of space itself, having better spatial and conceptual hacks, as SpaceGodzilla has never really shown to do things such as literally cut through the concept of space itself, or, obviously being the embodiment of the concept of itself. Higher dimensional gravity is impressive, but this really shouldn't be that much of effect to Palkia. While Palkia's space hacks would be a lot more effective on SpaceGodzilla, both do have conceptual hacks, even if I would argue that Palkia's is arguably stronger. SpaceGodzilla should have conceptual hacks or resistance to conceptual hacks to a degree, so it wouldn't matter too much. Well, once again, Palkia can also erase beings from existence. SpaceGodzilla would resist it off upscaling off of Heisei Godzilla's own resistance. And while, once again, Palkia can raise its power and speed with some moves, nothing to the degree that Heisei cells couldn't react, adapt, and evolve to. Neither could Palkia counter SpaceGodzilla constantly draining his energy, something he constantly does in character, to where he would literally just drain the energy of the opponent. And there's no reason he couldn't do this to Palkia, considering he's done this to characters in the same tier of dimensionality and power as Palkia. So while Palkia definitely has the better offensive hacks, I would say, SpaceGodzilla not only has arguably higher scaling, and better defensive hacks, allowing him to simply just overcome Palkia with the growth, for example. Even if Palkia can once again negate some of the regeneration and immortality SpaceGodzilla would have. Leading me to say that SpaceGodzilla would ultimately win. It would definitely be a struggle for SpaceGodzilla, especially with Palkia's various ways of durability negation as well, and bypassing the regeneration and immortality SpaceGodzilla would gain. Nothing SpaceGodzilla shouldn't be able to handle and just outgrow and adapt to, honestly. These heisei cells are just kind of broken, which gives SpaceGodzilla the inherent advantage, especially when SpaceGodzilla already has higher ends and merits for his scaling, which has better arguments for 6th dimensional or higher into 5th dimensional, unlike Palkia, who is at best really just infinitely into 5th dimensional, unlike maybe Arceus or True Form Arceus or something, who definitely could have better arguments for 6th dimensional or possibly even higher depending on what you buy for the character. In conclusion, I think Palkia would lose this and SpaceGodzilla will be the definitive winner, mid to high diff. If you enjoy my content, please consider to like, subscribe, and share this video, and peace.